technology, it was two adjacent boardrooms. Anyways, my name is Ted Ritzer. I'm with Alberta Environment and Parks, and we are hosting this Greening Government's speaker series. Our first speaker is Mark Anielski, and Mark has been doing some fascinating research in Alberta for, must be a couple of decades. I think it was about at least 15 years ago that I was exposed to some of Mark's research, particularly related to your book, The Economics of Happiness. And at one point, you actually worked for us, Mark, right, as a resource economist? Oh, sorry. At one point, Mark, you worked for Alberta Environment as a resource economist way back?
Yeah.
Yeah.
1984 to 1999.
And I think it was actually forestry in the day.
It was forestry lands and wildlife, and then when Ralph Klein came in, it was, we were subsumed into environment, worked for Ron Hicks.
Yeah, well, there you go. He's one of us.
And then Treasury when I finally left.
And with that, Mark is going to talk to us about natural capital and well-being, and I'll turn it over to Mark Anielski.
All right. So, welcome everyone. I think some of you have chat capabilities, so if you want to send me some questions, I think that's appropriate. I know I can't hear you ask questions, but at least you can type them. So, thanks, Ted, for inviting me to their first Zoom webinar, whatever we call this. And some of you may have heard me speak. When was that, last year and a half ago? Or
last January.
Yeah, last January. So I'm going to walk through some of my most recent thinking and work in terms of this connection between natural capital, what we call natural capital, and this well-being theme. And so I'm going to walk through the slides that I've prepared and just give you a little bit. Okay, this technology is kind of weird.
There's about a 5-second lag for slides to load.
Yeah, perfect. So that's my pretty face in front of our house in Old Strathcona. Doug knows where I live. And the Premier's my back door neighbor, so it's kind of convenient. Call it policy notes on the clothesline. So I'm pretty excited that we have a new government, and I spent most of my career in the Alberta government trying to promote this idea of natural capital as a basis of good governance. That my primary argument, having an accounting, forestry, and economics backgrounds, we run this province, we run, in fact, all governments without a balance sheet. And as an accountant, that's a complete violation of basic accounting principles. So in 1990, I read a piece when I was, that time I was still with the Environment and Policy Group. I was a part of the policy secretariat under Leroy Pierbonne, who's my minister. And I realized that there was this work going on in Washington looking at the fact that natural assets were not being accounted properly. And they weren't, because if there was no balance sheet, there was no way of tracking whether a nation was actually sustainable. And the GDP could keep rising, it could keep harvesting, timber, extracting oil, but nothing was going on the balance sheet side because there was no balance sheet. So when I read that piece of work by World Resources Institute, I took it upon myself to, off the side of my desk, not part of my job description, to say, what would Alberta's natural capital accounts look like if we began to develop one? And I knew enough, being in the policy group and being part of land use planning, that we had enough data to answer part of that question. How much timber, how much oil is in the ground, what's our carbon liability? In 1991, I did a first paper, of course. Some of you know, you can never get a paper published as a bureaucrat, but I decided I would still write this paper and present it in Stockholm. I'm going to come in. So this paper really set, for me, it set the stage for my work, which is said that at that time I showed that Alberta's carbon liability was significant, that we were running a carbon deficit with nature, that our emissions were far exceeding our absorptive capacity of the land base. But there was even to this day, there's still no full disclosure of that reality, no honest sort of accounting of that. And so what is Alberta's liability worth to the world, right? We know we're the big extractor of oil, but we take no responsibility for the liability we impose on the planet, either in financial terms or ecological terms. So for me, my work was about simply good governance and good bookkeeping, and that the budgets of this province should reflect our natural asset superpower, which we are. You know, right now we have $9 trillion. Yeah, it's like $9 trillion. It's like the Wizard of Oz. Yeah, it is like the Wizard of Oz, actually. So one of my so for a good 25 years now, sort of advocating the same ideas of which province will go first and present in developing a set of natural capital accounts. That the Premier can go to New York. The Premier was just in New York, meeting with the bond markets, right? What do the bond markets, what do the financial markets care about? Well, actually, they care about what Alberta as an asset is worth. But the Premier has no balance sheet. So she doesn't know. She might know that the oil sands is worth, at $43 oil, is worth $9 trillion. And it's going to last 200 years at current production. But what's the ecological liability of that oil sands production? If you price carbon at $40, $50 a ton, what is that liability worth? And who should care about that? Well, the financial market should care. The reinsurance industry should care. And so this is not rocket science. It's not, disruptive accounting here. This is just good old plain, balance sheet asset accounting. And to me, it's remarkable that after all these years of trying to advocate for what seems like common sense, we still have no province committed to producing these accounts. No national governments, even the federal election, nobody's talking about Canada's natural assets. I had the experience of working as expert witness on the Enbridge on the Gateway pipeline, and I did the ecological values at risk assessment for that pipeline. I wasn't for or against the pipeline. I'm saying from a basic pure accounting perspective, what are the net benefits of this pipeline? Never discussion about how much oil we should be exporting from this country. Only about the pipeline. I said, we're not looking at the right, fine, we can look at that specific site, but let's look at the macro issue. How much oil is left in this country? We're the third largest reserve on the planet after Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. And that means we have unbelievable potential to do something with these natural assets that can generate what I would call a new economic model based on well-being. So I just want to walk you through that. It's kind of a vision. I have the pleasure of working with First Nations now. I've not that I've given up on governments. It's just First Nations are unique because they're like nations. They're independent. They're small. I can work with 1,000 people. One chief. It takes me a long time to get to the Premier or the Prime Minister, but I can meet with the chief tomorrow and say, Chief, Chief Tony Alexis from Alexis, you need a natural capital balance sheet. What's that? Okay, let's show you how this is going to be useful for you to ensure that your people enjoy long-term well-being. You've been here 10,000 years. Be here in 10,000 years if you think about these assets. So this is a slow. So one of the joys I had on slide is, just a sec. Oh, this is taking a while. One of my favorite projects is I'm an advisor to Tahiti, French Polynesia. And this was like two and a half years ago. And what's going on here? What? The far side is being disconnected?
Don't know why that is. You're still alive though. Keep going.
Am I still alive?
Yeah.
All right. So one of my favorite projects now is working with French Polynesia, which are the Polynesian people, or the ancient people who actually, they sail to Hawaii. You know, they basically, you know, were sailors of, you know, using the stars, and they're an interesting country because they're actually still colonized by France. And I said, you're a natural capital superpower. You have 5 million square miles of sea space and 300,000 people. You're the perfect scale for us to work at. So I have the pleasure of going down there in hopefully in December when it's cold here to help them think about how to develop a new economic model based on well-being, not just pure GDP. And I said, and guess what? You can even infect the French with this, because the French kind of know something about quality of life. And so we want to help you, President Tamaru, now the past president, establish a national balance sheet for French Polynesia as a precondition for actually seeking true self-determination. Right? If you don't know what your assets are worth, you have nothing. You can't bank against them. You can't develop economic policy against you know, a lack of information. So let's say that we want to set. So part of the mental shift here is shifting from this, you know, this World War II relic called GDP, gross domestic product, which is just like it's like an income statement that only counts money changing hands. And so every dollar that changes hands is positive for the province. Like, well, that can't be true. I mean, every suicide or every divorce and every cancer surely is not a net improvement in our well-being. But that's how we treat those events. Every oil spill, every ton of carbon that gets released, it's a positive, but it can't be a positive. So how do we kind of set our compass point on well-being? And I'd argue we can base that on what's emerging as a science of well-being. You know, everyone's probably heard of Maslow, and you know, there's hierarchy of needs, and we can build this new accounting and management framework on some principles like wealth, health, relationships, and even happiness. Right? Though I'll downplay the happiness because.
Keep going.
So when I wrote my book in 2007, I had mentors like Ray Anderson. Ray Anderson, as some of you may have heard of Ray, he stole the show, I think, in the movie The Corporation. Ray was the founder of the largest carpet manufacturer in the world out of Atlanta, Georgia. And he had a personal, he called it a spear in the chest experience when he realized that he, as he described it, I am the captain of the end of birth. What did he mean? He said, we produce the most indoor carpet by volume in the world. And I realized that some of those carpets are going to end up in landfills, and they're going to take 300 to 400 years to break down, if that. Don't even know. And so can we retool our company so that we become a restorative company? So we internalize all those waste streams. We change the way we think about product, and we don't just sell carpet to the Alberta government so you can put it down. Right, this could be interface carpet right here, right? This carpet will last for 50 years, right? It'll just wear out where we walk on it, but it's really resilient stuff. And he said, well, let's change the model, the mindset. Instead of purchasing this, how about you lease the services of it? And we'll take responsibility for the full life cycle of the product. So it's kind of like a total different mindset. Unfortunately, well, he was a pioneer. He had the ear of President Clinton and others. So he's a personal chapter of mine because I used to teach business ethics at the U of A. So I'd always talk about Ray as kind of the model for new capitalism, enlightened capitalism. And he would have said, you're absolutely right, Mark. We need to think in terms of full cost accounting, full life cycle accounting, not just for the company, but for the whole nation. So I've done a lot of fun things since I left the government in 1999. And it just, what I realized is that a lot of things that I would dream about inside, I could now get paid to do by some pretty cool clients. Not that people like Ron Hicks didn't support me. Ron used to say, you're just slightly ahead of your time, Mark. And I realized if I'd stuck with it, I would have been right up there, you know, the deputy of deputies. But, you know, I chose to pursue a path that I thought would be more meaningful. And it was difficult at first. You know, leaving civil service was not easy. I love the civil service, and don't get me wrong. But I thought, why would the phone ring for an ex-civil service guy? But it did start to ring. So I thought, all right, these ideas seem to be resonating with people. And in 2001, Rob McIntosh and Elizabeth May, I'll never forget it, at the U of A, Rob says, I don't know if you know who Rob is, but Rob is the founder of the Pembina Institute. He was a high school teacher in Drayton Valley, and he and a bunch of other teachers said, after the Amoco blowout, they sat down with Joe Clark, and they said, can we make sure this never happens again? Like, this is a black swan event. And so they created the Pembina Institute, and Rob said, why don't you come work with us? We're the dream team. So I joined Pembina, and we raised $160,000 to develop the Alberta Genuine Progress Index, which was an attempt to develop, it was a research project that Western Diversification funded to basically say, could we develop an accounting system that actually measures sustainability? And what would it look like if I look back to when I was born in 1960? So the green line is, Alberta's GDP chugging along beautifully, growing at 2.5% per year roughly. But the overall index of well-being, which is 50 indicators of well-being, which included a lot of the metrics that I had helped develop in measuring up while at Alberta Treasury, were included in this index, not from Ralph Klein's tenure, but going back 40 years. And it showed a different picture, that our well-being was stagnant, if not declining, against GDP. So this idea that the economy has to keep growing for us to improve our well-being was kind of vilified by the very indicators that the government actually used to measure its progress. So I thought, well, of course, I got the ultimate compliment, I think I said this last time, from Ralph Klein on the National that night. It was blacked out in Alberta because of Hockey Night in Canada. But guys in Toronto were like, what did you do in Alberta when Ralph had no comment? I'm like, wow, Ralph, no comment. That's impressive. When Ralph has no comment on this work, then we struck a nerve. And the front page of the Globe and Mail was "Fat Cat Albertans Struggle with Happiness." That was the tagline. And I'm like, I didn't even talk about happiness. That was, so I knew that we were onto something. We were trying to measure what matters to the well-being of Albertans. So let me walk you through some of the genesis of these words, because words are powerful. So when I say genuine, people go, that's a loaded word. Ted, you can tell me what, in terms of timing. So when we developed that word Genuine Progress Index, and then we developed in the US, in a think tank called Redefining Progress. And they were the first economic think tank, that actually said there's something wrong with GDP. And Bobby Kennedy got it right when he said, we're not measuring what matters. So, well, what's the alternative? How are we going to retool the accounting system that all nations use to measure what matters? So, well, let's use this loaded word called genuine, which means authentic. So that begs the question, well, what is an authentic life, right? What is authentic well-being? And that's going to be subject to, right, our philosophies and our approaches to living. And it's very difficult to say, we should count the cost of divorce, because for some of us, divorce is a good thing, right? It really was a good thing, wasn't it? Except it created two households and more spending and more, like anyone who's been divorced, are like, it's a nightmare. The lawyers get rich, and the kids need two sets of bikes because, it's great for GDP, right? Okay, let's agree it's great for GDP. But anyways, so this word genuine is kind of a bit loaded, right? But it does require us to say, well, what are the foundations of well-being? Now, the word wealth, turns out the word wealth comes from the Old English, means the conditions of well-being. Well means well-being, and the letters TH means the conditions of something. So health and wealth are close cousins. I didn't know that. I never knew that. I thought wealth was just stuff that my financial advisor told me to maximize, right? Save your money and retire, with big pile of dough or whatever, and invest in the stock market, and on and on. So we've all drunk the Kool-Aid, right? So that's what I was starting to realize as I was writing the book. All the words that I was taught in economics. Economy means household stewardship. The word mortgage means a death pledge. Competition means to strive together, from the Latin. And I think, wait a minute, my forestry training was actually true. Like, ecosystems are the model for the economy, right? And this money system we have is completely bankrupt, is based on nothing but faith. So all of these, like, I felt like Dorothy sometimes. Like, I don't actually need to see the Wizard of Oz because on the way I got it. Like, the eyes were open, right? I don't need courage. I don't need a heart. I don't, let's just speak the truth to these words. And let's use, when we say these words, let's understand that they mean something significant. So this is just a Wardle saying that this is some of the stuff I'm doing with First Nations. Sounds like, if we think about putting well-being at the center of our decision-making, at the center of the government's business plan, imagine if the vision of Alberta was, the vision of the Premier is, when Mayor Iverson, I exist to improve the well-being conditions of citizens. That's it. How are we going to measure the progress? How are we going to measure the integrity and health of the land and the spirit of the people? And, it's actually not that hard. But when are we going to start doing it? When are we going to start writing our budgets so that the well-being ROI of this province is the key metric? My inspiration was Bobby Kennedy. A few months before, he was shot in August, I think. So he made this impressive speech and said something so profound. I said, in the middle of the speech, had nothing to do with GDP. At University of Kansas, he said that the gross national product measures neither a wit nor a courage nor a wisdom nor a learning nor the joy of our children's play. He said, in short, it measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. That was 1968. 1968 happened to be the lowest point in inequality in the United States amongst income groups. It's been rising ever since. And we know that inequality kills civilizations. The Chinese know that. So we have to respond, I think, to Bobby's challenge. And that's all I'm trying to do. It's like, let's respond, in a common sense way to this challenge. And it's remarkable, all the conversation in the world. Yes, we know GDP, conversing, we know GDP law. It never meant measurable being. But that's where the conversation stops. It's like, oh, my internet connection is unstable. I love that. Just when I'm talking about Kennedy. Okay, move on to the next slide. We don't want to talk about the Kennedys. Sounds good. So, response to Bobby's challenge. This is a graph of the U.S. Genuine Progress Indicator, which I had the good fortune of working on in 1999, just after I left government. I was hired by that U.S. think tank, and it was like a dream job. And so, what this graph shows is the U.S. GDP, the blue line. The Genuine Progress Indicator, which is taking some of those social and environmental costs into account, including the value of unpaid work. 35% of our economy is unpaid work, spending time with your kids, your ailing parents, right? Volunteering. So adding those values, we still get a much lower statistic in monetary terms than the GDP. Come close to source. And notice that those other bars going into negative space, that is the estimated environmental liabilities that the United States is chalking up due to non-renewable energy use, pollution costs, air, other toxic waste. And those are, of course, increasing because they continue to build up, completely unaccounted for. So that's part of the main adjustment in the Genuine Progress Indicator. Now, this is a monetized adjustment. This is the chief economist of Treasury, when I produced this work for Alberta, said, I really like that piece. You did a really good job. I said, this is actually the most fictitious part. Putting values on this stuff is the most creative part. Measuring the actual physical conditions of well-being is the easier part. So we had a lot of debate about this work, and it created. So, I studied accounting, but I never learned that these two dudes. There's Leonardo in his old age, supposedly, and this guy Luca Pacioli, father, a priest, a Franciscan monk. In 1492, they write the treatise on double entry bookkeeping, the whole basis of accounting. Debits equals credit. As in nature, so in accounting. There was no such thing as a profit in Venetian times. In the Venetian business class, there were guild society. So these guys Leonardo doing the geometric drawings, which Lucas, his benefactor, was the Duke of Florence, is standing behind him. These guys came up with the accounting system, which I think they borrowed from the Sumerians like eons ago. And it basically says you start with inventory, you produce a balance sheet which has assets and liabilities and equity, and then you produce an income statement. And all wealth belongs to God, right? Wasn't that the end of the story? 500 years later, we still have no public sector balance sheet. It doesn't make sense. Anyways, in accounting at U of A, I never heard of these guys. So here's a definition: the word wealth, conditions of well-being. So in the model I've been developing and applying in certain jurisdictions, including Alberta and some in the city of Abington, and with varying degrees of success and some resistance, is this idea that, let's say there's 5 assets in a community. There's human capital, which is our health, or spiritual, mental, physical well-being. This one's written for First Nations because elders are important to them. Dreams and hopes and stories are important to First Nations. Our social cultural capital, our kinships, our belonging, our trust of each other. All these things are more difficult to monetize, but we know what trust feels like, right? So, and natural capital, which is the subject of today's kind of presentation, which is where I've spent most of my career focusing on. So natural resources market and ecological goods and services, and for traditionally used for First Nations. Felt capital, infrastructure, and financial capital, which is the most fictitious of all the capitals, because it's, I could go on about how money is created, but that's for another day. So these capitals are kind of, they talk to each other. This is kind of like a Maslow's hierarchy. So you'd have to say that, without water and land, we wouldn't have an economy. So let's imagine that there's some kind of hierarchy of these capitals, where natural capital is the foundation of any economy. So that's just a kind of a structural piece. In terms of, is there an emergent, people say, well, on what basis are you arguing that a new economy of well-being can be founded? And I said, well, let's agree that the natural environment is the foundation upon which society rests, and that there are these other attributes of well-being, including wealth, defined by, now I'm going to redefine it, go back to our understanding of wealth being material and financial well-being, health being physical, mental, emotional, relationships, which are turns out relationships are the most important defining feature of quality of life in Canada, and happiness, self-actualization, the most difficult of all, right? The attributes too. As Maslow said, that's what we aspire to. But what is happiness? Well, the word happiness comes from the Greek word eudaimonia, which means the well-being of your soul, of your spirit. So there's no way I'm going to be able to measure this, the integrity of Ted's soul. It's not my business, and but that's what we kind of all aspire to, that kind of enlightenment apex in our lives. And we can ask questions about happiness, but to measure it objectively is difficult. So let's talk about natural capital, because that's the focus of today's seminar. So what is natural capital? It's land and natural resources, including the soils and forests and water, and species and life forms, from which ecological systems and life supporting services are provided to humanity free of charge, right? Nature doesn't give us an invoice. So we treat it that way. We say, oh, it's ours for taking. We should get every barrel of oil out of the oil sand tomorrow, right? Isn't that our entitlement? Well, if you look back at Lucas saying all wealth comes from God. Now, what is our stewardship function? And I believe First Nations got it right. They know that everything comes from the Creator. No one owns property. It was, they had skirmishes on the land, but they made arrangements to sort it out right here in Edmonton. They had gathered here every summer to make, to negotiate relationship with the Blackfoot and the Cree, who were usually warring, would come here, Donald Ross Flats, and meet. And it was their market, right? It was where they made decisions about how they're going to go into the happy hunting grounds in the winter and survive. So these are really practical things. They didn't have money, right? They just had a way of knowing that You know, the buffalo and the caribou and others were healthy. And in fact, they use seashells called the cowrie shell and dentile shell, which came from, guess where? French Polynesia, like from the Tahitians. How did it get it to Alberta? Don't know. Right? Why seashells? Don't know. No one knows. Was it just a joke? You know, that they sewed these things on their dresses and wampum belts. And again, I'm fascinated by, you know, their story, because they've even forgotten, you know, why seashells. So I went to Tahiti. I went, I'm holding one of these little shells. This used to be money, right? And really, they've forgotten too. So the point is, money can be whatever we want it to be. And if it's not tied to natural assets, then what is it tied to? So what is natural capital? So we have market natural capital, and I'm showing you this slide because I'm working with First Nations, saying how do we, on a land use, if we're going to share this province with Treaties 6, 7, and 8 responsibly, these people, they've been here a lot longer than we have. They aspire to the same quality of life and well-being we do, and they're the poorest of the poor. They supposedly have rights to traditional use in their territory, but really, are we delivering that? Are we providing them the opportunities to optimize traditional use benefits from every hectare of land? Or are we just interested in maximizing timber harvest and every barrel of oil without taking responsibility for the liabilities that we impose, both on nature and sometimes on these people and ourselves? So I'm like, look, I think there's a win-win scenario here. If the game of Alberta is to optimize a return on every hectare of land in terms of total value, I think we can do that. And again, it's just good old, you know, accounting for what are the benefits that nature provides us that we sometimes take for granted, especially ecological services. And we all know how to count the value of a 2x4, but what's the value of a moose? You know, well, it's the replacement value for cow protein. Really? No, it's not. Not to those people. Because the moose, if the moose even exists, it means their habitat is healthy. Well, how do they know the habitat's? Well, because the moose is eating the same herbs and medicines we find sacred. Oh, so when you eat the moose meat, you're also eating all those medicines, right? Do you and I know those medicines? I don't have a clue. And so ecological services, this is all the complex stuff where some economists have said, you know, there's lots of services that nature provides, like pollination and habitat for wildlife, and all of these, like say there's 20 of these services, most of them have no monetary value. Carbon sequestration is starting to have value, but it's kind of I think it's kind of one of those creative accounting things that we're doing. I just want to show you what the UN can produce. This is the UN slide of the connection of ecosystem services and human well-being. And those arrows just give me a headache. It took me a while to redraw that diagram. Like, I don't know what this, you know, as a policy guy, all right, all I know is I'm going to get freedom and choice when I'm ready to eat the sausage. But, you know, so what are the connections between ecosystem services, and how do you prepare a budget around this stuff, right? But this is the complexity of what, you know, scientists are defining as the relationship between ecosystem services and well-being. So I have these slides because this is what's important to First Nations. So say, okay, you white guy, you know. Remember Chief Rose said, what's the value of a moose? And I said, I couldn't respond. And she said, well, it's not $1, is it? And I said, no. And she says, you know, it's all those herbs and medicines that we find sacred. If that animal finds them sacred, we find them sacred. And so as a planner, I was like, then all I need to know is if that land area has as much diversity as possible in terms of those plants, low bush, high bush, cranberry, you know, wolf willow, you know, all of those kind of those plants that they don't share that information with us because they're like, we don't want pharmaceuticals coming in here making money on something we think is sacred because that plant will be gone in a month. So they're very careful about what they share in terms of the value of those. They just pretty pictures of things that are sacred to them. It's taken a while to refresh.
It's working for me.
Is it good? Who knows what that is?
Sweetgrass.
Who could tell me what sweetgrass? What's sweetgrass used for?
Spiritual ceremonies.
Spiritual invocations for.
Who in this room knows how to identify and pick sweetgrass? I do. I learned that last year. It's weird. It's like it all looks like grass, but you got to know what you're looking for. Right? Here's a skill testing question. How many feathers in a Sioux headdress of a chief? 33. How many poles in a teepee? Anyone? Guess. Sacred numbers. 13.
Fibonacci series?
Probably. Pretty cool. 33 feathers. Why 33? There's a wampum belt. But those are seashells woven. This was the treaty that the Onondaga signed with George Washington, the Two Wampum Treaty. And I was in the longhouse in Onondaga, upstate New York, last year. And that wampum belt, the wampum treaty belt with George Washington was laid out. It'd be like piling a whole bunch of gold on this table, right? It just represents a relationship, an agreement that those two signed. So even George Washington somehow appreciated the importance of these ceremonial things. So of course, economists wouldn't be without a graph or a few graphs. So this is the work I've done with the city of Abington. Worked with their chief economist a few years ago, who said, I want you to replicate what you did for Alberta, that Alberta Genuine Progress Indicator, and do it for Abington. So here it is. Here's Alberta's, or Abington's GDP is a blue line, and it's indexed back to 1981. That's her base year. So it just goes from 100, and you can see the worst, you can see the downturn, the 2008 downturn in the economy, and of course it's recovered again. And that green dotted line is actually the environmental index. So you can see that, it lagged for years. It's been recovering thanks to new homes being built, greater energy efficiency, probably better vehicles. So we're seeing an improvement in the overall well-being of the environment. And then the other indices are economic and social. These are just some graphs about, so one of the strengths of this work is showing the GDP compared to other indices. So this is Abington's GDP compared to Abington's ecological footprint. Footprint is a measure of how much land every person needs to meet their current expenditure needs. So you can imagine a lot of our spending is probably unnecessary. It's into the area of wants versus needs, but nevertheless, the footprint continues to rise as our spending rises. And so this is an interesting challenge. Can we live on a footprint that is equivalent to the provincial land base? So this is a piece of work that my colleague and I did for Alberta Environment a few years ago. So they asked us to do the whole province. So this image shows the spatial footprint area of Edmonton and Calgary, the major cities. So you can see that, of course, our footprint is much larger than our geographic boundary. But the good news is there's still a lot of land available, in theory, to, you could say, biocapacity available for use by other nations, other communities. Like Holland, there's no way Holland can live without importing. But Canada could shut its borders and be quite okay. Its biocapacity is about 2 times larger than our spatial footprint. So we could easily live within our means. So we're one of the rare countries that can do that. But this gives you an idea that if you're land use planning, you're like, all right, can we bring some of our needs closer to home, reduce the transportation. A lot of our, of course, Abington imports, about 90% of our needs are imported from somewhere else. So, that's why it's important to support farmers markets and things like that. So we can, if nothing else, just to help our neighbor be better off economically in terms of those who are growing our food. I had to show a picture of Warren Buffett because Warren Buffett, one of the most successful investors, he goes to sleep at night reading annual reports, and he looks at Coca-Cola's balance sheet and goes, I like whoever came up with this number that Coca-Cola's brand is worth 20% of their balance sheet. I like that. Right. I'm just imagining saying that. Where's Alberta's balance sheet? We don't have one yet. So what would a balance sheet look like for natural capital? Here's a kind of a mock-up. It would have land and water resources as assets, both ground and surface water, energy, of course, including our renewable energy capacity, our minerals, our ecological goods and services, which aren't really assets, or they're the outcome of healthy ecosystems. And then our liabilities would include greenhouse gas emissions and toxic waste, and then we'd have some accounting for the distribution of wealth of natural capital. Who owns? Of course, we say we own this, but then we give rights to industry to extract the resource, and presumably we should be getting the maximum return in terms of royalties from that resource, which we own. I can tell you right now, we're collecting less per barrel of oil than we ever have since ever in our entire history. Less than 5 cents on the dollar under the. This is prior to the NDP taking office, and Lougheed was collecting around 27 cents on the dollar of production. So I was there last night at the royalty review thing. I'm like, no one's talking about the graph that is an explosive graph that shows that our legacy, right? And we have nothing to show for it compared to what the Norwegians have. So how did we just sort of agree that that's, we needed to compromise and make allowances to industry when we have the second largest supply of oil in the world, right? And it's just not acceptable. So, but a natural capital account would show this, would show the value of the oil sands, would show the liability, it would show the return on investment in terms of royalties per barrel of production. But those numbers aren't produced probably for, I don't know. I've been in that system. I've had those discussions with the treasurer, and it's like, I said to Jim Dinning once, like, how much natural gas is left in this province? Do you know? No, I don't. Why don't you know? You should know. You're the treasurer. There's 12 years of natural gas left. That was in 1997. And I said, you're not getting the right information. So anyways, not always easy to deliver that message. And you think, well, where's the resistance kind of? What's so risky about shining a light on these issues? And that's, as an Albertan, it's still confounding to me. Even last night, I'm like, Dave Mowat, love you, guy. You're a great banker and you're leading this thing. And it's like, what happened to the fair share debate? This guy can't even define the word royalty. You don't even know what the word means. Right? And so we're having this debate, and I was like, what's the point sometimes? It's frustrating. And there's businessmen there, right? There's industry guys who should know what a balance sheet means. And yet, anyways, sometimes I think, gosh, I should just go to Oz sometimes. So the fundamental question, I'll just end with, these are the questions I think that need to be in play. Are we getting the highest and best use of our natural assets? What does that mean? Real estate guys can tell you what's the value of a condo per hectare or acre, or a single detached dwelling, or commercial real estate. And yet, do we have numbers like this for Alberta's land? Do we have it for LARP? Do we have it right? Are we willing to accept that there's a liability per hectare, and what is it? Is it as much as the benefit? Is it, those are things I think we need to take seriously. What contributes to our well-being and impairs it? There are liabilities that we're imposing on our health, and we need to be honest about it. So this is just examples of work I've done in the past, the boreal forest study that Sarah Wilson and I did a few years ago to put a value on Canada's boreal, which is the biggest land ecosystem. The Mackenzie study that we did, we were very excited that the date show seemed to have a land use plan that celebrated the importance of traditional use values within this very significant watershed. Um, things like tree cover matters to the city of Calgary. The higher the tree cover in the watershed in the Bow, the lower the water treatment costs per liter. Engineers of Calgary should know that, right? So that's how we start to value nature. How about a well-being account for Canada on a watershed basis? This is the work that I did for the Canadian Index of Well-being, to say if Canadians just typed in their postal code and they could get a quick quality or well-being index for their watershed, what would it look like? So we developed these data layers. This is using the some of you know the water quality index by map by sub basin. So these are just, this is what Canadians could in theory, you know, type in your iPhone and here's your carbon budget. Here's what these watersheds are either releasing or absorbing carbon. The red is net release of carbon. Orange, well, actually orange and red are net release. You can see how BC is completely decimated, like the pine beetle. We've got, you know, look at Ontario, how green in Quebec and Ontario are. And Alberta, of course, some of the gray areas is agricultural land. But very quickly you can see where Canada's carbon budget is. How about soil organic carbon? That's a map of, you know, the best soil organic carbon, the dark green. And here's a map of Canada's carbon liability. These are point source greenhouse gas emission data set mapped by, and you can see Abington. You know, Abington has one of the most toxic postal codes. You know, the refinery road, just right. Thank goodness it blows in Saskatchewan, because our particular matter would be even worse, right? So you know, so these again, we can create these kind of inventories and maps and have a conversation as Canadians. This is a map of MPRI toxic substance releases, and if anyone knows the MPRI data set, it's very difficult to create a composite index of all different compounds and say, what's the toxicity profile of my postal code? Again, you can see Edmonton, it's red. So it's got one of the highest, well, of course, also east of Calgary there. You can see, of course, Toronto, all that, Sarnia, Hamilton, you know. And this is a map of the, I would call it the fragmentation, the loss of integrity in the boreal forest, as colored by red based on linear disturbance maps. Those are maps of the Swan Hills 1949 and Swan Hills in 1991 with all the couple blocks and seismic. This is work John Thompson, John and I worked together at Alberta Environment back in the 90s. He's economist, I was policy guy. So we did this work for the North Saskatchewan watershed, mapping GDP and ecological services across the whole, right down to the 500 square meter resolution. We can do this. We can optimize economic well-being across any watershed. This is the environmental index for the Canadian Index of Well-being. You see it doesn't look very good compared to Canada's GDP. This is the most recent work I did for Ducks Unlimited. They hired me and said, Mark, can you help us make a business case that the conservation of wetlands is in the national interest? Because we want to take this to Mr. Harper, Mr. Flaherty. I said, yeah, let's do this right. We'll like Nature Conservancy, we'll show you how to book a wetland as an asset. We'll show Canadians it's not just for ducks and hunters. It's cleaning water, it's storing carbon. That's a real rancher, real Ducks Unlimited hero, like south of Calgary. And yeah, so it was a great exercise. It's a little bit, even for Ducks Unlimited, it's a bit, you know, really our accountants or PwC auditors aren't really agreeing with you yet. I said, I know, not yet, because under formal accounting rules, you wouldn't book that ecological service value. But for management strategy purposes, for policy purposes, you absolutely have to do this, right? And you can show governments then how to book these assets properly. Almost done. These are all the details about what we calculated for Ducks Unlimited. I calculated a societal well-being and return on investment. I said society enjoys a $22 benefit for every $1 invested in land conservation. Pretty sweet return on investment. You're buying that wetland from Farmer Joe. costs very little per acre, to remediate it to an ecological level of integrity isn't that expensive, and then to maintain it is pennies on that acre. So why doesn't the province do that? I think the province now is valued to wetland at about $19,000 a hectare. I think that's a number that's out there. All right, that's a good start. Blah, 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 blah. My daughter Renee says, "Dad, you talk too much." So that's her kissing a dolphin. It would end up in philosophy. John Ruskin, the great English philosopher, said, "There's no wealth but life, life including all its powers of love, of joy, and of admiration." So again, what's the optimum balance of development that achieves a positive well-being for societies? And are we? If the game now is going to be to optimize well-being in harmony with GDP, I'm not throwing GDP out, then how do we set up our accounting and management policy decisions to orient in that way? That's it. That's a sunset in Tahiti. Like at 3 p.m, you'll come down to the beach and Tahitians are just sitting in the water. That's sweet. Because they can. Because they used to have a lifestyle in which they probably worked 2 hours a day. That was it. They just went in the water, fished, got a fish, repaired the hut, made love on the beach. And now they're lost because they bought the French Kool-Aid. I'm like, get back to what you had, right? So sometimes less is more. And I think well-being is the final frontier, where no man and woman has probably gone before or yet. That's it.
So I think now is the time to open it up to some questions, starting with the Edmonton group.
Do you think with the new government there's going to be the opportunity and the willingness to look at properly capturing this into the balance sheets and that type of thing?
Yeah, I'm working on it. We have some, good connections, shall we say. But not to do it in a way that's not apolitical. I don't care who's in power. When Prentice was in power, I was ready to go to see Jim and say, "Come on, Jim, let's do it. Let's do this. You come out of the banking world, and right, this is not revolutionary. This is going to put Alberta on the map in an interesting way, improve our social license to operate, right? Be responsible for it. We have a responsibility. We have this massive oil reserve, right? We're not going to stop using it, but so let's count the things properly and then develop a budget. If this oil is going to be around for 200 years, right? The only question is, are we maximizing the return on the resource, right? And if you can't answer the question, then go back to your advisors and tell them to do more homework, right? So I am hopeful, right? The only question I always ask is, where's the resistance? I can understand that people don't want to change. People are reluctant to. But after, I've been trying to do this since 1990. I'm not saying I'm not trying to beat my own drum, but internationally too. And the fact that we still don't have a firm commitment to doing this is remarkable to me when it just seems such common sense. Well, that's all I'm asking for, some common sense.
Most of us seem to be focused on the material wealth sort of thing versus the Zen mindful approach, which that's what you're talking about.
Yeah. And I don't
Nations, whatever.
That's right.
Mindfulness.
So I think I'm excited by working with First Nations. Do they have their challenges? Absolutely. They've got trauma. It's horrible in some ways, right? But there's some progressive chiefs. There's 640 of these nations across Canada. Surely there's going to be one or two who are like, let's do it. And that's where I'm really excited because, gosh, maybe they can lead us out of the wilderness somehow, that we're so stuck in our, right? And it makes sense that we're stuck because we were educated in it, you spent your whole career in it, and to kind of change is challenging.
To start setting models with First Nations and you give something to refer to and you're trying to sell the idea to someone else, you're like, well, these ones have adopted, this is how it went, and you start building examples and things. Good.
Yeah.
To do it.
Yeah.
So Doug, you had a question?
Yeah, Mark, being the oldest guy in the room.
Wait a minute, I might be as old as you are.
I'm quite interested actually in sort of your personal application of your work and that type of thing.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a rhetorical question. I've sat with you in your kitchen before, and I think I gave you a small piece of slate that was from my home to your home.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, so I'm obviously into that kind of stuff because that was a number of years ago.
Yeah.
You know, what do you sort of aspire? How does your work affect your personal life? And is there any message there for the rest of us?
That's a great question because it's. I mean, on a personal level, I would say that my path to my route, path to happiness. Of course, it's a pursuit of happiness, as Jefferson said, is never finished. But for me, it was about my relationship with money, getting out of debt, killing that mortgage, or at least eliminating the mortgage, freeing our household up from the need to work as many hours as I had to. And then realizing, gosh, I have more discretionary time. So time is the most precious of all things. I mean, yeah, I can buy more stuff or bigger house and have a new mortgage. I can, get a high-paying job. So on a personal level, the journey is being, sort of becoming less encumbered with the anxiety about the money issue, right? And then saying, all right, now I can pursue work that's meaningful. Hopefully the phone will keep ringing. Like, I'm not, I don't take any. I mean, I think that, and the biggest challenge I've had is sometimes my book is in a way being so successful, I sometimes start taking things for granted. So it's like keeping your eye on the prize, staying prudent and pragmatic, trying to meet people where they are, right? Where the clients are, listening, really trying to listen to the client, not just trying to sell my thing. But really that freedom. And so since leaving government, my wife and our girls have enjoyed, a quality of life that I can't even imagine when I was caught up with the money anxieties, right? And all it was just a freedom, and then writing my own business plan to say, these are the hours I have to work, right, to achieve the well-being needs of the household. That's really not that hard. But most people are lousy at money management. I said, I could probably make a business just coaching people on how to write your own little business plan, right? And that's been my path. And of course, there's a spiritual, with all of us, there's a spiritual part of my journey that I sometimes share. And, it's a deep part.
Sharing.
Yeah, you're welcome.
More questions here?
I was going to ask how many countries are doing a real value, or I've heard of happiness index, and I can't remember which country.
Bhutan, yeah.
Yeah. So how many countries do you know that are doing more of a wellness index?
There are a number of, there's like Britain. I was just in London. Britain has been a real leader. The last two prime ministers, Cameron's been a real champion of well-being, which is really exciting, and driving that down to the municipal level of accountability as well. So yes, surprising Britain, Holland, of course Bhutan is gross national happiness. And I'm an advisor to Bhutan. They've invited me to come in November. They have no money to pay, for airfare. It's like, look, going to Bhutan would be, why don't you go? I'm like, because I could go to Tahiti and I get actually have a contract, and I could sit and watch this for the next 10 days, So, and so I think we have to be careful not to get enamored and so romantic with. Like Bhutan has had its own challenges. Like it's got a new prime minister who's more pro-development. They realized as they opened their borders, Bhutan was this kind of Buddhist, Shangri-La, right? That had no TV, no internet. People still cook on wood. I'm like, do you want to live that way? And now things have opened up, and now they have to decide, do we trade with China or India for hydro? So, reality kicks in, right? So what we think was this ideal place to go and find a new path to happiness, and my opinion is they could still achieve that, but let's think about some prudent approaches to governance. That's why I'm saying when I speak about balance sheets, it's not, or assets, it's not, it's not revolutionary. It's just common sense. And you can cleave that on to gross national happiness, let's say, as a national policy. The other good news is, there's things happening right here in Edmonton. There's an initiative called the Community Assets Abundant Communities Initiative. My friend Howard Lawrence is leading at a neighborhood level. So what does that mean? Going around to your neighbors and say, what are your assets, Doug? What do you love to do when you're not working in government? What would you like to do with others in the neighborhood? That is kind of a way of engaging in our relationships, right? And saying the gifts are abundant in our community. We have idle assets. Airbnb. You look at all the Uber. Like suddenly you see this explosion of this understanding that there's idle assets, a spare room, and when we create, the technology works and can facilitate, right? So I see it. Maybe it's not happening fast enough at these sort of macro levels, but things are happening at the person, at the neighborhood level, and that gets me excited. So, yeah.
So are there more questions here?
There's a question from,
Oh, excellent.
if a municipality is interested in accounting for natural capital, where would they start? Well, a municipality, of course, it has land, and like the city of Edmonton has agricultural land. So it has developed land, of course, commercial and residential. It has parkland. It has, of course, what they call, I would not call it agricultural land, because suddenly we get into definitions that bleed into what the province will use. So I'd rather call it food land or something, land in which we can grow food, like the Horse Hills area in northeast Edmonton, which we had a big debate about. Is that was zoned, that was agricultural land, and then what does the city do with now when it annexes that land, given that it was held by private farmers? How can it treat it as an asset? So cities too are good at, like the city of Edmonton will say, well, if we cut one tree here, we have a policy replacing that tree. So those are ways. Municipalities are also collecting greenhouse gas emission, or they're modeling greenhouse gas. Should be clear, they're modeling greenhouse gas emissions as a national commitment to that, and trying to measure carbon footprint in that. So those are examples of natural capital accounting at the municipal level.
Any more questions going in online?
No more questions. Any more questions before we sign off?
Well, one of the things that I've been surprised with my neighbors, and most of my neighbors work for either oil companies or pipelines. And when I've gotten to know those neighbors, they've actually kind of told me is like, don't presume or assume that because we work for an oil company or a pipeline company, that natural assets aren't important to us for our quality of life. We breathe air, we drink water, we live in our spaces. And why presume that just because we work for oil and gas, that we're any different than anyone else? So, and I think what you're saying, Mark, is that we have the tools to provide sort of a comprehensive analysis within this balance sheet that works as much as our industry as against the industry.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyways.
Thank you. I mean, that's a great closing reflection. Is I think the progressive companies, right, are the ones that understand. I mean, if you look at what Teck, the biggest mining company, did with the Tunaha in BC and with Nature Conservancy, they established one of the largest conservation easements, right? And it was kind of a win-win fair kind of resolution, where a company, Nick Milligan, who's the guy at Teck, worked with Nancy Neuhaus at Nature Conservancy in the Tunaha Nation and said, how can we all benefit from recognizing that, not putting a fence around this, but recognizing that a shared kind of approach to optimizing well-being actually might be in our mutual interest. And so, and the companies, like some of you know, like my most recent work with the Alexis Sioux Nation here, was to help them assess traditional use values on a proposed pipeline right away by TransCanada. So you heard me say I worked for the Enbridge thing. I learned a lot. A lot of it was drama and a lot of emotion and stuff. But if I step back, there's an opportunity for TransCanada to go, we would cut that forest and remediate to grass because that's the cheapest option. But if you walk with elders, I tell people this, in 2 days, walking that bush with elders near Edson, I learned more than 4 years of forest science here at U of A. Because they basically said, this is our garden. This is our pharmacy. Don't tell anyone else that, but can I eat that berry? Can I eat that berry? Yeah. Eat that berry, you're in trouble, but not really in trouble. It's just, but the point is there are medicines there, right? And I learned so much from them. And one of the guys who led that study, he's from Calgary, he's an oil guy, Barry Hofstein. He said, what's cool about plants is the closer you get to these people, the more you realize the plants literally will come to you in your dreams. I mean, this gets into the kind of, what? You mean they come to you in your dream? Yeah, they want to heal you. Like, wow, like, wouldn't that be cool? If, we paid attention to a plant, like a little bush cranberry coming to Doug's dream saying, you should plant me in your front yard. You should, because, and I'm looking at this little strip of, which is about to be cut, which is right next to an existing pipeline right away. I'm like, this area is abundant. This is probably sufficient to support 5 families, right? On a subsistence, on a traditional use lifestyle. Has no value. So what I'm trying to show the First Nations is, look, this isn't about fighting the industry. This is about actually trying to work with industry and the province, saying we have a right to wander and collect in this area. You call it public land, crown land. We disagree. We don't think it belongs to anyone. But that said, industry's given a right to produce, put a pipeline there and maybe make $1 million a year on this little area. And what are you getting from it? Right? And so surely there's got to be a mutually beneficial land use planning and right, development strategy here that everyone is going to succeed. And TransCanada is going to look okay. Their social license operators, they got a better relationship with the First Nation. They're not in court, fighting over, which is what the fight on the Enbridge was, right? The failure there was that they didn't build relationship with the First Nations. They didn't treat them respectfully. And so it's like, sometimes it seems, so for me it was like, wow, I think there's a cool future here where the smart industry are going to say, really, we just need to spend a little more time in that relationship. And those elders are going to be employed. Those poor elders are making $500 a month on their Canada pension. They can't live on that. And they are full of wisdom, right? 7-year-old guys walking the bush with me. So I'm like, they have so much to teach us, right? And we still have a lot to learn. Anyways, that's where I leave with kind of hope and like, all right, this province is awesome. We have so many options. Yeah.
Well, we're booked till quarter after in terms of the webinar. It could actually technically go longer. Are there any more questions coming in online?
No, just that one question, unless no one else gave a. Okay. Any other comments?
Thank you very much. This has been good.